The training ground was alive with noise. Boots struck the hard ground in rhythm, shouts from instructors cut through the air, and the hum of machines filled the rest. Every recruit moved with urgency, sweat dripping from their faces, each one, determined to prove themselves stronger, faster, tougher than the next. All except one. She lagged behind, her steps heavy, her breath already short though the day had barely begun. Her body didn't match the others. They carried themselves like warriors, their shoulders squared, their movements sharp. She stumbled often, her arms shaking when she tried to lift the same weights the others tossed around with ease. Even when she gave everything she had, it looked small compared to what the others could do. The instructors noticed. They always noticed. Their eyes lingered on her longer, their voices harsher whenever she made the smallest mistake. Every time she fell during a run or failed to keep up in combat drills, their disappointment filled the air like a shadow. They didn't need to say it out loud, but she could feel it. She didn't belong here. The other recruits didn't hold back either. They whispered behind her back, sometimes not even bothering to lower their voices. They laughed when she struggled to lift her training gear. They smirked when she was the last one to finish an obstacle course. To them, she was a burden, someone who dragged down the pace of the class. They had already decided she wouldn't last, that she was a mistake in the ranks. But she never walked away. Every morning, when the alarm sounded and the recruits lined up, she was there. Her body ached, her arms bruised, her knees scraped. But she showed up. She wasn't blind to her weaknesses. She knew she was slower, weaker, less skilled. She could hear the whispers, feel the stares, but she carried them silently and kept moving. On one training day, the recruits were ordered to spar. They paired off quickly, eager to prove their strength. She was left standing at the end, waiting for someone to reluctantly step forward. When she finally faced her opponent, she barely lasted a few seconds before being thrown to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of her, and the laughter of her classmates echoed around her. She stayed down for a moment, staring at the ceiling lights, pain radiating through her body, but then she pushed herself up again, slowly, with effort. But she stood. She didn't complain, didn't beg for rest. She simply took her place back in line. Her opponent shook his head in disbelief, and the instructor's glare lingered on her as if expecting her to collapse again. But she remained standing, trembling but unbroken. Day after day, the pattern repeated. She struggled, she stumbled, she failed in ways that were visible to everyone. Yet there was something different about her that only a few noticed. While others cursed when they fell, she rose in silence. While others boasted after victories, she stayed quiet even when she managed small wins. She had no pride to protect, no reputation to defend. All she had was the will to keep going no matter how hard the day was. Late at night, when the others rested, she stayed awake, practicing quietly in corners of the training hall. Her punches were weak, her stance sloppy, but she repeated the movements again and again until her arms ached. She ran extra laps when no one was watching, her breath ragged but her steps steady. She knew she could not become the strongest overnight, but she believed she could become better than the day before. Still, the weight of failure was heavy. There were times when she sat alone, head lowered, wondering why she was here. She remembered the faces of her family, their hopeful eyes when she had been selected. She had wanted to make them proud, to prove that she too could rise above, that she too could be part of something greater. Now, she feared she had let them down. Yet each time doubt tried to bury her, she clenched her fists and whispered to herself that giving up would be worse than failing. The instructors debated privately about her future. Some argued she should be dismissed, that keeping her in the program was wasting resources. Others, though fewer in number, noticed her persistence. They saw the way she never refused an order, the way she stood back up no matter how many times she was knocked down. They wondered quietly if there was something in her that couldn't be measured in drills or numbers. The turning point came when the recruits were pushed into a survival exercise. The task was simple on paper: carry supplies across a long stretch of rough ground and reach the checkpoint before nightfall. For most, it was just another challenge. For her, it was nearly impossible. The pack strapped to her shoulders felt heavier than her own body, and the rough ground scraped against her shoes with every step. She fell behind quickly, her legs aching, her lungs burning. Others shouted at her to keep up, their frustration clear. Some even mocked her as they passed, leaving her in the dust. She stumbled more than once, landing hard on the rocks, but each time she pushed herself back to her feet. She could hear the voices in her head. "You're the weakest. You don't belong. You'll never make it." But she refused to let them be right. Step by step, she kept moving forward. By the time she reached the checkpoint, the sun had dipped low, and the rest of the class had already finished. The instructors were waiting, unimpressed. She was bruised, bleeding, and trembling with exhaustion, but she dropped her pack at the finish line with quiet pride. She hadn't won, she hadn't even come close to keeping up, but she had not quit. That night, while others rested, she sat alone, staring at the stars above the training camp. Her body ached more than ever, but her spirit was strangely steady. She realized something important. Strength was not only about speed or muscle. Strength was also about showing up when no one believed in you, about standing when everyone expected you to fall. She was weak in training, yes, but there was something inside her that even failure could not crush. The others didn't see it, yet. The instructors didn't fully understand it either. But deep within her, a quiet fire burned. A fire that would one day turn weakness into something far more powerful than brute strength. The announcement came at dawn, when the recruits were barely awake and still fighting the weight of yesterday's drills. The instructors lined them up in the yard, their faces as stern as ever, and spoke about the next challenge. This one would not be about running or sparring or lifting. It was something different, something that tested more than just muscle. The words were short, cold, and clear. Each recruit would face the predator cubs. The name alone stirred the air. Every recruit had heard the stories. The cubs were young, but they were still predators. Creatures bred for violence, creatures whose instincts were sharpened before they had even learned to walk. Facing them was supposed to prove strength, courage, and readiness. But to most, it was nothing short of terrifying. Some recruits exchanged nervous glances while others forced smirks to cover their fear. She stood quietly at the end of the line, her hands clenched behind her back. Her heart thumped hard inside her chest. She knew what the others thought. They believed she would be the first to fail, that this would be the moment she broke completely. They had called her weak every day since training began, and now they waited to see her crumble. The instructors gave no comfort. They only reminded the group that this test was not about winning or losing. It was about surviving. That alone was enough to twist fear into every heart. Surviving against creatures that knew nothing but instinct was never easy. When her name was called, the whispers started. Some recruits chuckled under their breath, certain this would be her end. Others shook their heads, pity in their eyes, convinced she didn't stand a chance. She heard it all, felt it press against her like weight on her shoulders, but she walked forward anyway. Her legs trembled, not from weakness this time, but from the storm building inside her. She was led down a narrow corridor, the sound of boots echoing against the walls. Ahead, a massive metal door waited, sealed shut. Beyond it, she knew, were the cubs. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and tried to steady her breath. The guard who escorted her did not speak, but his smirk said enough. No one expected her to walk back out unscathed. The door opened with a loud hiss, and she was pushed inside. The sound of it slamming shut behind her echoed like final judgment. The room was dimly lit, its walls smooth and cold. For a moment there, was silence, and she stood there, frozen, every nerve in her body alive. Then she heard it, the soft scrape of claws against metal. From the shadows at the far end, glowing eyes appeared. One pair, then another, then more. The predator cubs stepped into view, their movements smooth and dangerous even in their youth. Their shoulders rolled with raw strength, their claws clicking as they moved closer. They weren't fully grown, but they were built to hunt. Their teeth glistened in the dim light, their low growls rumbling in the space between them. Her breath caught in her throat. Fear wrapped itself around her chest, urging her to run, to scream, to fight blindly. But she forced herself still. She remembered what she had learned in training, not about fighting, but about control. Predators could sense fear. They fed on it. If she let panic take over, the cubs would feel it instantly, and then the test would end in disaster. The largest cub stepped forward, its nose lifting as it sniffed the air. Its eyes locked onto her, bright and sharp, waiting for her to flinch. She kept her gaze soft, not challenging, not retreating. Slowly, she lowered herself to the ground, crossing her legs and resting her hands on her knees. Every movement was careful, deliberate, designed to show she was not prey but not a threat either. The cubs growled louder, circling, their tails flicking with impatience. She could feel the weight of their stares on her skin. Sweat rolled down her neck, but she kept her breathing even, her expression calm. Inside, her heart thundered, but outside, she was still. Minutes passed like hours. The cubs tested her, lunging a little closer, baring their teeth, growling louder, but she did not break. Her body screamed with fear, every instinct begging her to run, yet she remained steady. She whispered softly to herself, words not for the cubs, but for her own strength, a reminder that fear was only as strong as she allowed it to be. Then something shifted. The smallest cub tilted its head and stepped closer, its nose twitching. It sniffed at her knee, its warm breath brushing against her skin. She froze, holding her breath, but she did not move away. Slowly, her hand lowered to the ground, palm open, empty, harmless. The cub leaned forward, sniffed her fingers, and then pulled back, confused but not hostile. The others growled again, restless, but the smallest cub did not retreat. Instead, it circled her once, then sat down just out of reach. The larger cubs seemed uncertain now. They moved closer, sniffing the air around her, testing the silence she created. One brushed against her shoulder, its fur coarse, its body warm. She didn't flinch, didn't recoil. She simply sat, calm and steady, her breathing soft. Beyond the walls, she knew the instructors were watching. The recruits would be watching, too. They expected to see her attacked, broken, humiliated. Instead, they saw something different. The cubs, meant to tear down her spirit, were hesitating. They were choosing caution over aggression. Finally, the largest cub lowered itself beside her, its massive head resting close to her leg. Its growl softened into something that sounded almost like a purr. The others followed its lead, circling her not as hunters but as companions. One curled at her back, another lay near her feet, their bodies pressing close. She sat in the center, surrounded, but not as prey. She closed her eyes, releasing a slow breath she had held too long. She understood then that the test had never truly been about strength of body. It was about strength of spirit. The cubs had sensed what the recruits and instructors never did, her calm, her patience, her refusal to give in to fear. In their own way, they had accepted her. When the door finally opened again, the instructors stared in silence. The cubs did not leap at her. They did not bare their teeth. They simply lifted their heads, watching as she stood slowly, her body trembling, but her spirit steady. She walked out of the chamber not with victory, but with something greater. Proof. The whispers that followed were no longer of pity or mockery. They were of confusion, disbelief, even respect. She, the weakest in training, had faced the impossible test and walked away. Not because she was the strongest, but because she carried a spirit the cubs themselves had recognized. And though she said nothing, though she kept her head bowed as she rejoined the line, she felt something inside her shift. For the first time, she wasn't walking in the shadow of doubt. For the first time, she carried a spark of something new, hope. The test with the predator cubs had ended, but the memory of it stayed with her long after she walked out of the chamber. That moment, when the cubs chose to curl beside her instead of attacking, had changed something inside her. It wasn't just relief she felt. It was a strange mix of wonder and quiet strength. She had gone in trembling, and somehow she had come out with her head a little higher. But outside, the world didn't shift as quickly. Her fellow recruits still looked at her with suspicion. Some muttered that it had only been luck, that the cubs had simply not been hungry, or that the instructors had staged the moment. Others whispered about what they had seen with their own eyes and couldn't explain. She noticed the difference in their stares. Less mocking now, but sharper, filled with questions no one dared ask aloud. The instructors themselves gave no sign of what they thought. They only marked their notes on the boards and moved on with the next trial. For her, that silence was heavier than words. She couldn't tell if they were impressed or disappointed, only that they had seen something they hadn't expected. At night, as she lay on her thin bunk, she thought about the cubs. Their glowing eyes, their heavy breath, their warmth against her legs. Most of all, she thought about the moment when she had forced herself not to give in to fear. That moment had been the hardest thing she had ever done, harder than all the drills and punishments put together. It was not her muscles or her speed that had kept her alive. It was something deeper, something in her spirit that refused to bow. The next days of training felt different. Every obstacle, every drill she faced with a calmer mind. Her body was still weaker than most. She still lagged behind when running long distances, still struggled to lift the heavy packs others carried with ease. But when it came to tasks that demanded patience, balance, or resilience, she found herself holding steady where others fell apart. One morning, during a climbing exercise, several recruits tried to race to the top of a steel wall. They scrambled, eager to prove themselves, their arms straining, their legs kicking against the metal. Many slipped and fell halfway. She didn't rush. Her arms burned and her legs shook, but she focused on each hold, one step at a time. When she finally reached the top, she wasn't the first, but she was one of the few who didn't give up. The instructors noticed. They didn't praise her, but she caught one of them writing longer notes on the board. That was enough for her. The others started to watch her differently. Some recruits still smirked at her slowness, but a few began to fall silent when she passed. They had seen her survive what they feared most. The cubs. They didn't understand it, but they couldn't deny it either. Still, doubt lingered. She could feel it every time someone whispered weak under their breath, or when they rolled their eyes at her struggling arms. She carried those doubts like stones in her pocket, heavy but impossible to throw away. The difference now was that she no longer let them crush her. It was during another test, a simulation in the wilderness, that the lesson of spirit over strength became clearer to her. The recruits were dropped into a barren landscape and told to survive for 3 days with only what they could carry. Many of the stronger recruits rushed ahead, eager to prove they could outlast hunger and exhaustion. She walked slower, carefully, choosing her path, her eyes always on the small signs of shelter or water. By the end of the first night, several recruits had collapsed from pushing too hard. She, on the other hand, had found a quiet place to rest beneath a ledge. She used stones to shield herself from the wind, collected water from the dew, and rationed her food carefully. She wasn't the fastest, but she was steady. When the third morning came, she was still on her feet while others limped back half-broken. It wasn't physical power that carried her through. It was her spirit, her patience, her refusal to give in when everything felt too heavy. And yet, the memory of the cubs always returned to her. It wasn't just a test she had survived. It was something greater. The way they had circled her, the way their growls softened when she showed calm instead of fear, it had been more than instinct. It had felt like a choice. Late at night, when the camp was quiet, she sometimes wondered if the cubs had seen something in her that no human had seen. To the recruits, she was weak. To the instructors, she was a number on a chart. But to the cubs, she had been something else, not prey, not threat, something different, something worthy. That thought gave her strength, more than any lesson or command ever could. It reminded her that strength didn't always show in the obvious ways. Sometimes it was hidden, quiet, invisible, until the moment it was tested, her. Turning point came during a group drill. The recruits were paired into teams to carry heavy crates across the yard. The crate she was assigned to was nearly impossible for her to lift. Her partner groaned in frustration, certain she would fail them both. Around her, she could hear laughter from those watching. But she didn't panic. She didn't let their voices sink in. She crouched low, took a deep breath, and lifted her, sighed slowly, carefully. Her partner grumbled the entire time, but as they moved step by step across the yard, something unexpected happened. She didn't drop the crate. She didn't rush and stumble. She walked steadily, her eyes focused forward, her body shaking but her mind firm. By the time they reached the other side, she was drenched in sweat. But she hadn't quit. It wasn't strength that had carried her through. It was resolve, spirit. The same thing that had kept her still in the chamber with the cubs. The instructors said nothing, but the silence in the yard was different this time. There was no laughter, no mockery, just a quiet awareness, as if everyone was realizing at the same time that maybe they had been wrong about her. That night, she sat on her bunk again, her muscles aching, her body weary, but her heart steady. She thought once more about the cubs, about how they had circled her, how they had chosen calm over violence. She understood now why. They hadn't bowed to her strength, because she hadn't had any to show. They had bowed to her spirit, to the quiet force inside her that refused to break. And in that moment, she made herself a promise. She would no longer measure her worth by how fast she could run, or how much she could lift, or how loud others laughed at her. She would measure it by the one thing that had carried her this far, her spirit. Because when strength faded and fear pressed close, spirit was what remained. She closed her eyes, letting the promise settle deep within her. For the first time, she wasn't ashamed of being the weakest in training, because she knew now that she carried something greater. Something even the predator cubs had seen, and though the days ahead would bring harder tests and heavier burdens, she was ready. Not because her body was strong, but because her spirit was stronger than anyone had ever guessed. The day after the wilderness trial, something unusual happened. While the other recruits were sent to the yard for drills, she was told to stay behind. A quiet order from an instructor sent her down a separate hallway, the one that led back toward the chambers where the predator cubs were kept. The memory of that place stirred inside her, how their eyes had glowed in the dark, how their growls had shaken her bones, how they had pressed against her like shadows that somehow became warmth. She walked with heavy steps, uncertain of what waited for her. The guards at the door gave her curious looks, as if they too were wondering why she, of all recruits, had been called again. The massive door slid open, and once more she stepped inside. The chamber was the same: dim lights, metal walls, silence, broken only by the sound of claws scraping against the floor. The cubs were already awake, pacing, their bodies tense with restless energy. For a moment, her fear returned, rushing into her chest like cold air. But then, one of the cubs lifted. Its head and recognition flashed in its glowing eyes. It let out a low sound, not a growl this time, but something softer. The others stopped pacing. Their gazes turned toward her, sharp and bright, but not hostile. She stood still, unsure of what to do, but the choice was not hers to make. The cubs moved closer, their steps cautious but deliberate. The largest one approached first, the same cub that had rested its head by her leg during the test. It stopped just a breath away, studying her face. For a long moment, they simply stared at one another. Then, with a movement that sent a shiver through her entire body, the cub pressed its head gently against her side. The weight of it was solid, powerful but not crushing. It was trusting. The others followed. One brushed against her shoulder. Another pressed close to her back, circling her as if to form a wall of protection. She stood in the center again, but this time it didn't feel like a test. It felt like something more. From the observation deck above, instructors and recruits had gathered to watch. Murmurs filled the chamber, voices questioning what they were seeing. Predator cubs were never tame, never calm. They were supposed to challenge recruits, not choose them. Yet here they were, surrounding the weakest recruit in the class. Not as enemies, but as companions. The instructors called out commands, testing the cubs' reactions. A loud alarm echoed through the chamber, a sound that usually drove the animals into frenzy. Instead, they only pressed closer around her, their bodies forming a protective circle. One growled low, not at her, but at the sound itself, as if warning it to stay away. Gasps rose from the observation deck. Some recruits pressed against the glass, wide-eyed, unable to believe what they were seeing. Others whispered nervously, unsettled by the way the cubs moved as one around her. The instructors exchanged glances, their faces unreadable, but it was clear this was something they hadn't expected. She stood still, hardly breathing, as the realization sank in. This wasn't chance. This wasn't luck. The cubs were choosing her. They weren't obeying because of fear or control. They were claiming her as their alpha. Her chest tightened, not with fear, but with something stronger. She had spent weeks being told she was weak, a failure, someone who didn't belong. But here, in the eyes of creatures born for strength and survival, she was something else entirely. She was leader. She was protector. She was alpha. The cubs pressed against her legs, rubbed their heads against her arms, one even lying down at her feet with a sigh that rumbled through the floor. Their warmth surrounded her, their trust settling deep inside her chest. For the first time since she had stepped into training, she didn't feel like she was standing alone. The instructors gave the signal, and the doors slid open again. Guards stepped forward cautiously, weapons ready in case the cubs lashed out. But the cubs didn't move aggressively. They rose to their feet, forming a wall around her, growling low at the guards who dared step closer. The guards froze, their eyes wide. She lifted her hand slowly, placing it on the shoulder of the largest cub. The growls faded. The guards exchanged stunned looks, unsure whether to proceed. One of the instructors shouted from above to stand down. The test, or whatever this had become, was over. When she finally stepped out of the chamber, the cubs followed her to the edge of the doorway. They stopped there, watching as the heavy door closed between them. But even as the metal sealed shut, she could feel their eyes on her, steady and sure. The recruits outside stared at her in silence. No one laughed. No one whispered weak. They had seen it too. The cubs, feared by all, had chosen her. In the days that followed, the story spread through the academy. Recruits repeated it again and again, each version more dramatic than the last. Some claimed she had whispered to the cubs like an animal handler. Others insisted it was some hidden trick by the instructors. But no matter how the tale twisted, one truth remained. The predator cubs had recognized her in a way they had never recognized anyone else. Training continued, but everything felt different now. When she walked into the yard, eyes followed her, some filled with awe, others with suspicion, but none with the open ridicule she once faced. Even the instructors seemed to treat her differently, their orders sharper, as if they were testing how far this strange bond could go. She didn't boast about what happened. She didn't even speak of it. But inside, she carried the weight of that moment like a secret flame. The cubs had not chosen her for strength of body or swiftness of mind. They had chosen her for something deeper, something no one could measure on a chart. Spirit, presence, heart. At night, she dreamed of them. The glow of their eyes, the warmth of their bodies pressed against hers, the way they had formed a circle of protection without hesitation. In her dreams, she wasn't the weakest recruit anymore. She was Alpha, walking forward with a pack that trusted her completely. What she didn't know then was how much that bond would matter. The instructors might not have understood it, the recruits might not have accepted it, but the cubs had marked her in their own way, claimed her. And in time, that bond would grow into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. For now, though, it was enough. Enough that when she lay down on her bunk, exhausted from another brutal day of training, she no longer felt small or forgotten. She felt seen, she felt chosen, she felt strong, not because of her muscles, but because of her spirit, the same spirit that even the beasts themselves had bowed to. The weeks after the cubs claimed her were not easy, but they were different. Before, every day of training had felt like a wall pressing down on her, with whispers of weakness following her wherever she went. Now, the air carried something new. The same recruits who once laughed at her now looked at her in silence. Some looked with confusion, others with respect, and a few with envy. She did not feel stronger in her body. She was still the slowest on the running tracks, still strained. To lift the heavy packs, still stumbled when pushed too hard in sparring drills. But inside, something had shifted. Every time her legs wanted to stop, she remembered the cubs pressing against her, choosing her. Every time her arms trembled with weight, she thought of the way they had circled her, protecting her from all else. That memory was no longer just a story, it was proof that strength could be more than muscle. One morning during combat practice, she faced an opponent who towered over her. The crowd of recruits watching expected her to fall within seconds. Her opponent struck fast and hard, knocking her down again and again. But each time she hit the ground, she stood up. Her body hurt. Her breaths came ragged, but her eyes stayed steady. She did not fight harder than her opponent. She simply refused to stop standing. By the end, her opponent grew frustrated, his strikes wild, while she stood bruised but unbroken. The instructors ended the match without announcing a winner, but everyone watching understood. Strength was not just about winning, it was about refusing to bow. And in that moment, the recruits who once mocked her saw it clearly. She had something many of them lacked. Her spirit carried her through every challenge that followed. During long marches, when recruits collapsed on the road, she was the one who bent down to help them up, even when her own legs shook. During harsh nights, when the cold ate at their bones, she was the one who shared her blanket without hesitation. She wasn't the fastest, wasn't the strongest, but she was the one others began to lean on when their own strength ran out. The cubs, too, became a part of her story in ways no one expected. Though they remained in their chambers, the instructors often brought her back to them, curious about the bond. Each time, the cubs greeted her the same way, soft growls, warm eyes, bodies pressing close as if she were part of their pack. The instructors tried commands, tried experiments, but the cubs only responded when she was near. To them, she was Alpha, and nothing could change that. News spread beyond the academy. Whispers reached higher ranks, stories of the weakest recruit who had been chosen by predators. Many dismissed it as rumor, but some saw the meaning in it. If even beasts could sense strength in spirit, then maybe there was more to her than anyone had thought. For her, it wasn't about recognition. She didn't crave attention or rank. What mattered was the change she felt inside. She no longer compared herself to others, no longer measured her worth by how fast she could run or how high she could climb. She understood now that strength had many forms. Some carried it in their arms, some in their legs, but hers lived in her spirit, and that was enough. One night, while sitting by the training yard after a long day, a fellow recruit approached her. This was someone who once mocked her loudly, calling her useless during drills. But now, his voice was quiet. He asked her how she had faced the cubs without fear. She looked at him for a long moment before answering. She told him the truth. That she had been afraid more than ever before, but she had chosen not to let fear decide her actions. She had chosen calm. She had chosen patience. And that choice, simple as it was, had saved her. The recruit nodded, silent, and walked away. But in that moment, she realized something powerful. It wasn't just that she had redefined strength for herself. She was beginning to redefine it for others too. As weeks turned into months, the change deepened. When recruits spoke of strength now, they didn't just point to the tallest or the fastest. They remembered the one who stood calmly in front of beasts. They remembered the one who never quit, even when her body was failing. They remembered the one who, through spirit alone, had turned predators into protectors. Her final trial came at the end of training. The recruits were tested one last time, placed in a simulation that mirrored war. It was not real, but it was meant to feel real. Loud alarms, heavy smoke, the chaos of survival. Teams were scattered, communication broken, fear spreading quickly. Many recruits panicked, running without thought, fighting without plan. She found herself leading a small group, not because she asked to, but because they followed her naturally. When they grew frantic, she spoke calmly, her voice steady even in the noise. When they wanted to split, she kept them together. When they froze, she guided them forward one step at a time. By the end of the trial, her team was one of the few to complete the mission without breaking apart. The instructors finally spoke of her in front of everyone. They didn't call her the strongest. They didn't call her the fastest. But they said something far more important. She had shown the kind of strength that others could lean on, the kind of strength that led not by force, but by spirit. For her, those words mattered more than any medal, because they proved what she had learned from the beginning. The cubs had seen it first, but now the humans finally understood. On the last night before graduation, she lay awake on her bunk, staring at the ceiling. She thought about the girl she had been when she first arrived, the one who stumbled, who fell behind, who carried shame in every step. And then she thought about the person she had become, the one chosen by beasts, the one respected by peers, the one who no longer measured herself by weakness. Strength, she realized, was not about being unbreakable. It was about breaking and still rising. It was about fear and still stepping forward. It was about standing steady even when everything tried to push you down. The cubs had claimed her as alpha, but in truth, they had only revealed what had always been there. Her spirit had carried her through every trial, and it would carry her through whatever came next. And as dawn broke on her final day of training, she walked into the yard not as the weakest recruit, not as the forgotten one, but as someone who had redefined strength, not just for herself, but for everyone who had seen her journey.